Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bevington. How can the number of eagles killed in Scotland tell us how many eagles existed in the past? And what does this have to do with my marriage? I'm slightly scared, but all will become clear very soon.
I want to talk to you about birds, Jan.
What kind of birds?
Well, do you have any particular birds that you like?
I quite like eagles. Do you like eagles?
They're all right.
What movie does a famous line come in which is, "The eagles are coming"?
I don't know. It sounds like you've been watching some really bad French cinema that's been overly dubbed.
Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings. The
Yeah.
eagles are coming. Oh, is that the one where people keep saying, well, why didn't they just ride the eagles in the first place?
Exactly.
And
It would have solved the whole problem. So when you say eagles, what do you mean by eagles? Because there's lots of different types of eagles.
When I say eagle, I mean a particular kind of eagle, depending on the context of the conversation I'm having. In this country, you'd be talking, and by this country, I'll restrict it to England for the minute, you'd be talking about not very many eagles at all. You might see the odd golden eagle that's just got lost on its hunting from Scotland, I suppose.
But Scotland has two types of eagles, the golden eagle and the white-tailed eagle.
They do indeed, and if I want to say I'm not mistaken, there's plans or maybe already afoot or already taking place for white-tailed eagles and around the Isle of Wight or something as well.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Yeah.
So yeah, I do know some things about eagles.
Wow.
I've seen the last golden eagle in England when it was here. It's not here anymore. At Haweswater.
Oh.
There was an RSPB reserve. There is still an RSPB reserve at Haweswater, which is a reservoir in the Lake District. And in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a pair of golden eagles, and went on through the 90s. There was a pair they bred quite successfully. Then there was only one, and so you had a lonely golden eagle at Haweswater for a
It's
while.
very sad to think
Yes,
of that.
it was. Yes, yeah.
So why are we talking about eagles?
It's a good question, Jan. Why are we talking about eagles? We're not just talking about it for, turning this into an ornithological podcast. We are talking about it for a specific reason. And that's because whereas normally I bring notes from home, you've brought something from home a bit bigger than notes today. You brought your husband.
That's true.
Yeah, I'm assuming there's a good reason for this, and I believe it's something to do with eagles.
It is indeed. So our guest today is Jason Harrison, who also, as noted, happens to be my husband. So he's a PhD researcher in the Department of English here at Lancaster University, and he's going to talk us through a piece of work that he undertook for his degree in sustainable mountain development, looking at golden eagle populations in Scotland.
I'm assuming that we can learn something from golden eagle populations in Scotland.
We can.
We can. Good.
About sustainability.
Because if we can't, it would sense that he'd wasted his life studying all about golden eagle populations.
No study is wasted.
Well, I beg to differ, given that there are certain universities offering Taylor Swift studies, etc., etc., etc.
Don't be rude to Taylor. She's my friend.
Is she? Is she really?
No.
No, I didn't think
I wish.
so. No.
So
Well,
enough of this. Enough of this. Shall we?
Yeah, I'll welcome Jason. I'm assuming you've already seen him this morning.
Yes,
But
indeed.
welcome, Jason.
Hi, nice to see you.
So, Jason, tell us then a little bit about where you studied, the University of Highlands and Islands, because that to me sounds like it's going to be in an episode of Balamory. I don't know if you know what Balamory is.
I do.
Yes, yeah. It sounds like it would come from the University of Balamory would be even better. It sounds like it comes from an episode of Balamory. But yeah, tell us a little bit about what that is, and also what sustainable mountain development is, because I'm interested in what that is too.
Thank you. The University of Highlands and Islands, or UHI, is a university that has its headquarters in Inverness, but it's what's called a dispersed campus, and most of its campus space is actually in further education colleges, the southernmost of which is Perth on the Scottish mainland, and the northernmost of which is in Shetland. And it covers the big, what's known as the Highlands and Islands, the big sort of rural area to the north of Perth, not so much to the northeast, because you've got Dundee and Aberdeen there, which are quite big cities, right up to the Northern Isles and right up to the Outer Hebrides. And sustainable mountain development is a strange term. It's actually, I'll say what it is first. It's really just sustainable development for mountain regions or areas obviously the needs of particular types of areas, be they sort of forests or mountains or deserts or whatever. They have particular needs for sustainable development. And the term itself, sustainable mountain development, comes from the UN Agenda 21, which was a document that came out of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. And there are various chapters that cover various needs. And chapter 13 is managing fragile ecosystems, sustainable mountain development. It's not so well known now because it was superseded by the Sustainable Development Goals, which came out in 2005, which is still current.
I don't believe they have a sustainable development goal for mountains, do they? Maybe they missed out.
No, they don't. But some of the needs, and listeners might be reading in the newspaper, some villages at the bottom of glaciers in the Alps are under quite a bit of risk and threat. And indeed, there was a big landslide through one of them, unfortunately. And so some of those challenges of remote areas, maybe quite fragile economies with different kind of environmental hazards, mean that all of the SDGs are relevant to mountains, but how they manifest in the mountain environment can be quite different. So it's a really cool subject area.
It makes me wonder, though, because there is an under the sea and oceans SDG. If there's something that goes that far down, why shouldn't we have something that goes specifically far up as far as...
It's life on the land, which is everything above.
Yeah, but then that's comparing the beach to the top of Mount Everest.
That's hugely varied.
Yes, hugely varied. So maybe it's a missed opportunity to have an 18th SDG.
Okay,
because 17's never enough.
Yes. It could be.
Jason, let's divert away from myself and Jan discussing what the UN got wrong when it came to classifying SDGs. Talking about your work then, you've looked at eagle populations in North West Scotland in the early 1800s. So let's look then at the early 1800s in the North West Highlands in Scotland. What was going on there?
Oh, quite a lot. We need to go back really to maybe 100 years earlier and before that. At that time, the mountain landscapes of particularly northwest Scotland, to a lesser extent other mountainous landscapes, were fairly well populated. Admittedly, it was a fairly spread out population, but I've referred to it in my writing as a mosaic of small farming communities. You'd see a patchwork of clusters of buildings, plots where oats and barley were grown, animals were kept. Most of the landscape was used in a fairly non-intensive way, so that these communities practiced transhumance. So they took their animals up onto the higher areas of the mountains. So they grazed them up there in areas called sheilings. And they used most of the land apart from the really rocky, steep bits, particularly the rocky parts. That all changed. It started in the latter part of the 18th century through into the middle of the 19th century, when their landlords decided that they wanted to get rid of these communities so that they could establish very large sheep farms, far more sheep than you'd get today in any farm. Thousands, that a farm might be 5,000, 10,000, maybe 10,000 sheep on it, and quite a large area. And that's instigated a whole wave, really. You'd think of it as over quite a long time of evictions, known as the Highland Clearances, and communities were either made to move to much more marginal land around the edges of these mountain areas, particularly the coastlines, or some of them emigrated. Some of them moved to the central belt to work in factories and things like that. That's the central belt of Scotland.
I think there's a whole different podcast around the political consequences
indeed.
And motivations and everything of the Highland Clearances, which I think maybe we'll avoid today.
Yes, I think so, because it's a consequence of the Highland Clearances on land use, which Jason's already alluded to about the sheep, but then what that meant for the eagles. So how are the clearances land use change linked to the fortunes of the eagles, and which eagles are we talking about?
The land use change, it wasn't just about moving people off the land. It was also about a much more intensive kind of ethos of completely controlling the local fauna, whereas before animals had been reasonably well left alone, things like foxes and crows and ravens and eagles. the landowners instigated programs of what they would refer to as vermin eradication, and a vermin could be anything from a jackdaw through things like wildcats and pine martens to foxes and golden eagles were particularly viewed as vermin. The other species, the white-tailed eagle, they don't tend to nest as much inland. There weren't as many of them, and they'd already suffered a lot because they're much easier to kill than golden eagles, because they tend to nest in more accessible places, and they're not as shy of people.
Is it also a case that when it comes to white-tailed eagles, they fish? Therefore, are they not quite as much of a threat to farms?
Possibly, although actually they're at the moment, because white-tailed eagles have been reintroduced into Scotland, and as you mentioned before, they have actually been reintroduced in the Isle of Wight as well now. They are blamed by farmers for taking lambs. They're quite versatile. They catch fish. They're a fish eagle, very closely related to the bald eagle that you see in the United States, a very similar bird. And they can catch fish out of the water. They also they're not very good at catching sort of agile things on land, but they will eat carrion, and they're not averse to eating lambs.
So they're still a threat to the livestock.
They can be. That's a subject of much discussion at the moment. But the golden eagles were much more, that population then, looking at other historical sources, was much more, was reasonably healthy. It's reasonably healthy today with big caveats, and it was more like it is now. There was a good number of them on nesting on, and cliffs and rocky bluffs and things in the mountains.
Yeah, I suppose I should have stressed they're perceived as a threat, because whether they are or not is a different matter, because different people have different perceptions.
I think this is a podcast where we say, well, let's put that aside for this podcast. That's another conversation altogether. So how did the estates, and probably worth telling our listeners what an estate is in this context as well, but how did those estates deal with reducing eagle numbers? How did they do it?
Okay. Well, I'll start off by saying what an estate is. It's a large rural land owning. We get them now. They're often associated with the landed gentry. In fact, I spent some of my childhood living on the estate of Lord Allendale. In the Highlands, they're often very often set aside for deer stalking or grouse shooting, a bit like the Forest of Bowland, a mere few kilometres from where we are now. The estate managers instigated a programme of eradication. They spent a reasonable amount of money on it. They employed people who would be known as fox and eagle hunters. So that's one job title. Because foxes and eagles were viewed as being the worst offenders as far as a threat to sheep is concerned. And those people are actually the predecessors to what are now called gamekeepers, whose job is often still to get rid of vermin, if you will, particularly not so much on deer stalking estates, but more on grouse estates. And in addition to having paid employees who would get a cottage and a wage, they also had a program of bounties that they paid for all these different kinds of vermin. The top bounties being adult foxes and adult eagles. They'd pay slightly less for eagle chicks, and then a bit less again for eagle eggs. And anybody could get that bounty in theory. It was quite a lot of money. I'd worked out that it was about 2/3 of the standard monthly wage for one of these fox and eagle hunters, or about the same as a month's wages for a manual labourer. So that's not an inconsiderable sum of money. They would let freelancers, if you will, get the rewards too. You had to demonstrate that you'd killed an eagle by keeping its head in its talons. Obviously, otherwise you could just say, "Oh, I've killed an eagle. Give me my bounty, please." They were a little bit worried about the freelancers doing a bit of surreptitious poaching on the side. I think they made them swear some sort of oath that they wouldn't kill any of the deer or anything on the land whilst they were there.
A lot of trusting going on there.
Well, I'm not that trusting, because it's interesting, and this is about accounting, Paul. You'll be happy to know. There is also like an audit regime. So you had to, when you we'll come on to when you presented, when you caught something, you go to the local magistrate. You go, "Look, I've caught this," and they would certify it. And so you'd need the certification and the talon and the claws. So there was sort of like an audit trail when you came to actually collect your cash.
How could you prove that an eagle had come from a specific place? What if one landowner's paying you 5 bob more than the landowner down the road? You just go and get it off the landowner wherever you want and take it to the one who's paying most.
That's a good question, actually. I hadn't thought about it like that. In the case of the area that I've studied, which is Sutherland, which is in the far north of Scotland, it's a very large, one of the old counties. It goes right up to Cape Wrath. The northeastern bit is Caithness, but the rest of very large chunk of northern Scotland up to Cape Wrath is Sutherland. And in that case, there was an association called the Sutherland Association for the Protection of Property, which was a committee made up of 11 farmers, I think, if I remember rightly, and they had a standardised system, and they paid out. They paid into this pot, and they paid out. So it wasn't. There was no point in trying to go to a different farm. There's a very large area anyway. If you'd killed an eagle, then they'd give you the money for it.
How, so to speak, then successful was this? How many eagles were left at the end compared to how many there were when this all started?
It was very successful. It's quite difficult to estimate numbers, but work that's been done that covers the whole of the British Isles, which includes Ireland, suggests that there was a population loss of between 35 and 80%. That's because both the loss and what the population was to start with are known within quite wide parameters, which gives you this fairly wide parameter of population drop. And more importantly, perhaps the range of the species contracted from mountain landscapes across Scotland and Ireland to, I think they'd already been eradicated from England and Wales by then, to just those in the Highlands and Islands.
So how do you know all of this? I know that sounds like a very wifely question.
It really does.
I apologise.
This does sound like the kind of conversation you should be having at home.
Yes.
How do you know? Yes,
So where do you get the data, like the number of eagles killed and those sorts of things?
The data that I had as a kind of starting point for my research, my research, I was looking to kind of ratify research that had already been done, is from sources that are documentary evidence, so records of the killing of eagles, and place names. Actually, there's a lot of places that we know that there were. There's I think there's at least 2 eagle crags in the Lake District, for instance, which aren't anywhere near this old nesting pair that Paul mentioned, and we're pretty sure that from records that there were eagles, and also from place names.
So this is a historical piece of research, Paul, which will interest you as a historian. So we went to the National Library of Scotland, where they have estates archives, and we ordered the boxes, and I read the cash books because that's the way I'm like. That's what I enjoy doing.
I don't think the accounts can still be put in from 1823, Jan. I think that the Inland Revenue are going to say it's a little bit past.
A little bit past it. But whereas Jason has said how much it was worth to the workers, I was trying to find out how much did it cost to the estate in general. And so what they were paying in these bounties were like pennies compared to the other kind of things going through. So that was kind of interesting to realise that there was an asymmetrical value in terms of cost and the benefit, which would, of course, prioritise people killing eagles. But we found something in the archives, which was super exciting. So I know the answer to this, but for the purposes of
this isn't your podcast. This is Jason's podcast. Let Jason speak for himself.
What did you find, Jason?
Well, we found, first of all, I'll mention that when you look at archives, it can be quite difficult to know what you're going to find. It's not like a library, and some things that they have a catalogue, and they have items in the catalogue, and some of them are quite well described, and you hope at least, or you get an idea of what you're going to get from reading the description. I pulled an item out from the archive called Game Bundle, and it's literally a little parcelled up bunch of, I don't know, say 10 pieces, quite small pieces of paper wrapped up in string. It's quite exciting because I wouldn't be surprised if it hadn't been opened since it was archived, or even before. Within that, we found a piece of paper which had a table on it which listed all of these vermin species. that had been killed over the period between 1819 and 1826. And I correlated this with the Sutherland Association for the Protection of Property. So I knew how many adult eagles, they also killed chicks, and they took eggs and killed things like foxes and crows and stuff. I knew how many adult eagles were killed per year over a 7-year period.
When you say a game bundle, I'm imagining you found like Monopoly, Cluedo, but no, it turns out not being the case. So what do you do with that data then when you've got it? How do you use it, and what kind of conclusions can you draw from it?
Well, a little bit like the other historical research, it's firstly good to think that you're not going to be able to draw any really accurate conclusions, but nevertheless, they can tell you things. There are methods that use the numbers of animals that are killed to estimate how many the total population is, which you can imagine. The classic method is known as the Leslie-Delury method, which is actually named after two researchers that worked with other people who researched an effort to eradicate rats in, I think, Calcutta in India, and also the catching of lobsters and other seafoods in Canada, round an island. The principle being the easiest way to work out a population of creatures is to kill them all. If you literally eradicate them, then you know that the population that year was, you kill 1,000 and there's none left, then the population was 1,000.
This has taken a very dark turn
Obviously.
all of a sudden.
I'm going to guess this wouldn't get past many ethical committees nowadays.
But also if you're catching the easiest way to understand it is that you're catching fish. There's a season for fishing a particular species, and at the beginning of that year, there'll be probably a few 100,000 or tens of thousands of cod or something, and you'll fish them, and it makes sense that over the period of the season you'll catch fewer as the numbers are depleted. And in principle, if you forward cast that in a mathematical sense, it's fairly simple, and you keep thinking, well, what's the rate of depletion of catch? At what point in the future will we not catch any? And in a sense, in principle, and hypothetically, then you would have fished all the fish, but you obviously don't do that. We're talking about, in this case, fisheries, which you want to preserve, but it gives you an idea of what the overall population is based on what you're catching.
Obviously, this is a long time before the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds came along and said, you stop killing all the birds. But were there people such as ornithologists back then who may be able to give an idea of how many birds they were still seeing? Was there anyone who was just watching birds and keeping an eye on birds for the sake of nature or not?
Again, it's going to get a bit dark. Ornithologists back in we're talking about slightly pre-Victorian, the period that I'm looking at, but ornithologists in the 19th century, in the Victorian age particularly, had a different attitude. So if you were interested in a particular species, you'd go out and you'd shoot some of them, and then you'd look at the stuff you'd shot quite often, and you'd maybe get it stuffed. So there were a couple of accounts, one by a man called Osgood Mackenzie, who was a big landowner who would shoot anything that moved and then speak in a fairly elegiac sense about, alas, these creatures are not with us anymore, as if he hadn't had quite a decent part in that, including things like, well, there's no ospreys on the loch anymore on the islands. I used to collect their eggs as a boy, but alas, there are no ospreys. And there was another chap who used to, an Englishman that used to go up to Scotland, shoot things and stuff things, and he's almost certainly responsible for the loss of particular species in a particular area. So they had an idea of what was there, and then they had an idea of it not being there anymore because they more or less owned up to having killed them.
It makes a lot of sense. You've brought your husband along today. I'll bring up my partner who works in museums, and she used to run District Museum and their collection of stuffed birds, stuffed animals, and not just from within the district where the museum operated, from all around the world, from New Zealand, from Australia, from Scotland, from all the places that we might talk about. They have them just so that the people living in Barrow-in-Furness can see what these animals and birds look like and get to learn more about them. That was, like you said, the way they did it. Let's shoot one, look at it, study it, stuff it, put it in a case, and have it on display.
Yeah. Wow. Can we try to lighten this podcast? Because currently it's a bit death and mayhem, I have to say. So,
I don't know there's much mayhem. It was very well organised how they got them all
well,
into
I
the
suppose that's
museums.
true.
Curators would be very upset if you said they oversaw a world of mayhem.
Yeah, organised death.
Yes. Yeah, organised death, I'll accept that. Yeah.
Okay, that's okay then. So let's take all these pieces together, Jason. So we've got some data with this run of what's been killed, and it was recorded because they paid money to people who had killed these creatures. We have some sense of then something about historical numbers from place names, but it's a bit hazy. You told us a wee bit about methods that existed that allow you to figure out how much a population is from how much you've killed. So maybe if we start with that method, tell us more about the method and then tell us what you found out from its application.
The method that I used it's actually a very new method, and it works on the same principle as Leslie Delury. We don't need to know much about those methods as such, but there's at least one reason why Leslie Delury is not suitable for this particular data set. I was very lucky. I was writing this dissertation and doing the research for this dissertation a little bit pre-COVID, a couple of years before COVID, and somebody, a Japanese researcher called Agatsuma, published a paper whilst I was doing the research. And I think without Agatsuma, I probably couldn't have done the research. I'd thought that there'd be something out there that I could use. And actually it came about whilst I was looking, which is a very, very, very lucky. The Agatsuma method works in an area where they're trying to eradicate creatures such as vermin. And in principle, if you know, if a population died in a particular year and you know how many were killed in that year, then you know what the population from the year before would have been based on growth rates of populations and the number of creatures that were killed the year before. So it makes an assumption that you're looking at the final last group, and you work backwards from there. You need to work backwards for a few years because the more you work backwards, the better the figures get. But in principle, it gives you the preceding populations for the year, which, as you would imagine, you would expect to be declining. In my case, I had a set of data that finished in 1826. There were certainly much fewer of them then. A caveat with the Agatsuma method is that you make this assumption that they've all gone. But obviously there might be some left, in which case you're really estimating a minimum for the population rather than a median or some other term that you'd want to use. So I worked back from 1826. I had enough years to backcast to 1819, which is when this eradication program began, and it gives me an idea of how many eagles there were flying about above the skies of Sutherland at that time.
I've just got a quick question here because you mentioned eagles fly. Therefore, they're not restricted to, there's a big wall there, I can't get past it. They could fly away as far as they want. They could come from as far as they want. Does that make it harder to measure populations of avian creatures than it does land-based mammals?
It does. We do have the advantage with eagles that they nest in the same place every year, and the breeding ones tend to stick with the same site year on year for decades, in principle, indefinitely. The previous methods have looked at, they don't really count the number of eagles so much as the number of nests and whether they're occupied. It's quite easy to see if your pair of binoculars or whatever, it's quite easy to see if a nest is in use or not. And you know where the nests are. They're all in well-known spots, and they have been for years. And that's kind of how the previous method worked. So they were interested in, they tend to work in nesting pairs. Now, I had to think about how many nesting birds there were as opposed to immature and juvenile birds, which are two different categories. You get juveniles that are like a year out of hatching, and then for sort of 3-4 years after that, they're immature adults. And again, it does create problems because they do range quite widely. So there might well have been flying birds from much further afield, and even the ones that when chicks fly the nest, they'll range all over the place, and when they're trying to breed, research has shown that they try and come back to where they came from, which inevitably means that they're waiting for a nest to one of the birds to die, or they might fight one of the birds to create a new pair or something like that. So that poor eagle in the Lake District, nothing. There were two up until 2004, and then there was a lone male which was displaying for a mate up until 2016, and then the poor thing didn't have any adults around to kind of come and start a new nest with it, and then it died. So you got a little bit off track there, but I thought that was nice. That was quite interesting.
It died. Well, I did tell you it had been there by itself for a while. I hadn't realised it was 12 years. That's quite a long
I just looked
amount
that
of
up
time.
last night, so I did a little bit of
12 years waiting.
Yeah.
So from all of that, quite simple but also quite complex calculations, what did you learn about the historical eagle population versus the current eagle population?
Yeah, the historical population, I would say, was both similar to the population that we've got now and different. It was similar in the fact that the nest occupation was either the same or even higher than it is currently. The last survey, we're actually about 10 years off the last big survey. They come once a decade, and the last one was in 2015. The last survey showed 508 nesting pairs with 70% of nest sites being occupied. So in principle, there could be around 750 nests. Back in 1819, there would have been a similar number of nesting birds, possibly more. But what I would say from that was that there were more birds flying about, not nesting, much more. And that's interesting in itself because the problem that we have at the moment is that there are issues with various bits of Scotland, but where the birds are nesting successfully, there aren't many mature adults to take the place of the nesting birds as they die or whatever. And the immature ones can nest, but they're not as good at it. So the nests are more likely to fail. So the population is actually has a level of instability in it, which you wouldn't have got you don't get in other parts of the world. It's worth noting that the golden eagles breed right across the northern hemisphere, and other populations are more successful because they have far more what are called floaters, which are mature adults that could build a nest compared to now. The proportion of nesting birds to non-nesting birds now, there's a very large proportion of mature adults. About 80 to 85% are on nests, whereas in other areas it might only be 30%. So there's a lot of birds ready to take over out there. So it looks like it was more eagles flying about. And that kind of speaks to the whole of Scotland, really, because as Paul noted, the range far and wide. So there would have been. There's no reason to assume that there weren't many non-nesting eagles flying about in other parts of Scotland as well.
Do they suffer at all from the problems that led to their decline in population? Are there still people who are killing them, hunting them? I know here in England there's a particular issue around hen harriers and what happens with hen harriers and how they mysteriously get poisoned and disappear in certain parts of the country at certain times of year. Do golden eagles in Scotland suffer from that at all now?
They do indeed. So in the east of Scotland, where there are many grouse moors, which are the same kinds of areas where hen harriers mysteriously disappear, golden eagles mysteriously disappear. That's interesting because the best part of Scotland for living as a golden eagle, apart from the persecution, is the east of Scotland. They've got a very good, a lot of hares particularly, a really good, and grouse indeed. They've got a very good supply of prey. When they do nest, the nests tend to be more productive, so there's a higher average number of chicks per nesting year. But unfortunately, in some areas, there are only 30% of the nests that are occupied, whereas in the west of Scotland, the prey isn't as plentiful. They don't breed quite as successfully, but most of the nests are occupied and used for breeding.
And we've mentioned that white-tailed eagles are back in Scotland. Does the presence of white-tailed eagles have any effect on the population of golden eagles? Are they hunting the same prey at any time? Because as you mentioned before, it's not just fish that the white-tailed eagles are going after. They can go after other things.
Yeah. Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, actually, not really. They occupy very different ecological niches. So the white-tailed eagles and golden eagles eat carrion, which is about the only food source that they share. Golden eagles are quite agile. They're more finely built than white-tailed eagles. White-tailed eagles are a big, bulky bird. A golden eagle has a similar wingspan, I think possibly slightly wider, but they're slimmer. They've got sharper beaks and a smaller body and things like that. And so there's an interesting account of that they will, I say, fight over carrion. There's an interesting account from an area in Norway where both species live. And one immature golden eagle, it might have even been a juvenile actually, managed to fight off 7 white-tailed eagles in a period of about 10 minutes over a sheep carcass, because they're much more aggressive and fighty. That's a good word. That's a proper ornithologist word. That they're much more fighty than white-tailed eagles. But apart from that, they tend to have their own ecological niche. The Englishman that was killing, whose name I couldn't recall off the top of my head, the Englishman that was going up to Scotland to slaughter wildlife made observations of 2 nests of the 2 species on a lochside up in Scotland, and it was quite interesting because you could almost form a picture of both the golden eagles and the white-tailed eagles kind of heading off in different directions, like, almost like going on your daily commute. So the golden eagle would fly into the interior and the white-tailed eagle would head off towards the coast. So they were nesting quite close, but they didn't bother each other.
So to draw all of that together, what wider conclusions could be drawn from this work?
A tentative conclusion that you can make from my research is that the land at the time that they were living on, quite sort of relatively infertile mountain land, grass and heather, the kind of thing that you picture when you think of the Scottish mountains, may well have been ecologically richer than it is now. So there may well have been more small animals like hares, particularly. You also get rabbits on places like the Isle of Mull. Although interestingly enough, there are still more rabbits and things like that over in the Hebrides, and that's where the most robust eagle populations are, both species actually, which is why Mull's a bit of a tourist hotspot for eagle spotting. So the land was quite possibly ecologically richer, which is interesting because that was at a time when a large portion of this land had people living on it and farming it, albeit in a very non-intensive way. So that tells us that the land does not have to be pristine, if you will, to save species, that humans and animals and the non-human, if you like, can coexist very happily, obviously assuming that the humans behave in a way that's sympathetic to the animals. Human presence isn't in itself a detriment to healthy and robust animal populations. And there are people at the moment that are descended from the people that were cleared from the mountain interior, if you will, a couple of centuries ago, who would like to re-establish, I suppose there'd be small holdings or crofts in some of the areas where there were people before as a cultural endeavour. And there's no contradiction there between that and making sure that the wildlife thrives.
So what are you doing now then, Jason? And I'm sure being married to Janet has to tie in somewhere to sustainability, otherwise you'd get kicked out of the house. How does it tie into sustainability?
Yeah, I'm hanging on there by the skin of my teeth, if I'm honest with you. So as obviously I did a master's degree in sustainable mountain development. I actually did another master's degree after that in human geography, in which I looked at the portrayal, in academic terms, you would say discursive construction, but that's a little bit jargony. The way that the landscapes of the Scottish mountains and the western sort of Highlands, really the northwestern Highlands, has been portrayed or viewed, and what are the kind of dominant views of those lands. And from that, I'm now working under 2 different supervisors. One is a professor of literature called Simon Bainbridge, who specialises in romantic literature and indeed literature around mountains. So the Wordsworth is the obvious connection there with the Lake District. They spend a lot of time in the mountains. And another historian called Christopher Donaldson, who's very interested in things relating to that. And I'm looking at the culture and history of Scottish mountaineering, really, particularly elite Scottish mountaineers, and how they've how they view the landscape, how they see it, and that has a big effect on the kind of dominant view of the Scottish Highlands now as a kind of big old empty mountain area with unspoiled lands and largely unpopulated, away from the villages and on the roads and the coast, is very much in keeping with their idealized kind of view of the landscape. And my hypothesis is that they've actually had quite a big influence on that, but it's not been researched. And it links through to sustainability because current populations of communities, really, particularly the crofting communities, they're very marginal and out like you get in many scenic parts of the country. Apart from tourism, the people there are quite limited as to how they can live and what they can do. And if the landscape was viewed in a more nuanced way, so that it wasn't seen as being that everything has to be kind of empty, that's empty at the moment, then that in itself will allow for sustainability. The obvious thing is obviously wind power. There's no reason why nobody wants to put a wind turbine on top of Ben Nevis or whatever. But at the same time, at the moment, people get upset that if they climb a mountain, they can see a wind farm, which is kind of ridiculous. They don't seem to be that bothered about the big road often an A road that they drove in on with overcrowded car parks and motorbike engines kind of echoing up through the glen in places like Glencoe. But they get very bothered at the idea of looking out over this kind of vast, wide horizons landscape and seeing wind turbines. And I don't see why they shouldn't be. And that's very much a kind of mountaineer's view of how things should be.
Another controversial area we won't go too far into.
I have two questions before we draw to a close, both of which you can possibly answer quite quickly. Did Wordsworth ever write about eagles?
No, I don't believe he did. I might be wrong. Simon might, my supervisor, Simon might have words with me about that. Wordsworth with me, haha. But
his sense of humour, this,
it's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not that I know of. No, I don't think he did it.
And have any mountaineers ever been attacked by golden eagles?
That's a good question, and the answer would be no. And we're back to the reason that the golden eagle's been able to stop itself from being extirpated, which is a kind of the proper term for local extinction in the Scottish Highlands, is because they just go away when people are near. And if you were anywhere near the nest, even if I've not heard of any nests actually being literally sort of, you put your hand up on a ledge when you're climbing and there's an eagle nest, because people tend to know where they are, but they fly off. And actually white-tailed eagles will not actually attack people who get near the nest, but they'll get agitated and stay nearby and sort of make a fuss, which makes them easier to kill. Because even in the days when rifles weren't very good, because the modern breech-loading shotgun didn't come about until the mid-19th century, even if you had a pretty rubbish flintlock rifle, you could probably get one if it was 10 foot away, making a fuss and flapping about.
Yeah. Well, there's points of continuation there, which I think is pretty interesting.
I reckon a golden eagle could take your little border terrier if you take it for a walk.
Please don't encourage this kind of belief.
I mean, personally, I'd be on the side of the golden eagle in this particular equation. Those border terriers yapping about in the fells when you're going for a walk, like off the leash, and this lot. Yeah.
But for our closing question, Jason, what's next for the eagles in Scotland and possibly eagles in the rest of the UK? Again,
it's all very tentative, but I think that there could be about 775. I've categorized it as breeders here because I get a bit sick of everything being sort of viewed as breeding pairs, because they're individual birds really, and they come and they go. But at the moment there are maybe 1,000 breeding birds in Scotland. There could be 1,450 or thereabouts, with a lot more mature birds ready to hop in or fly in to take over when nests need a new adult bird to breed. Obviously, that's all very dependent on the prevention of eagle persecution in the Eastern Highlands. It's all very no organisation ever holds its hands up and says, well, it was people from our state or whatever. It's always rogues and bad apples, but I don't believe that. I don't think these people could do this without the tacit sort of knowledge of the people that own the land and the sort of Gamekeepers Association and things like that. There could be eagles back. There are relatively new pairs in southern Scotland, so there could be eagles back in parts of the Lake District. Obviously, the Lake District isn't that different from now to what it was, say, 20 years ago when the pair were breeding around Haweswater. Same with North Wales, obviously. And yeah, it'd be nice to see more of them, and it'd be nice if it was a more robust population.
That's a very positive note to end on. Thank you very much for joining us, Jason.
Thank you.
I suspect, Jan, that was more painless than you expected it to be. The look on your face when you walked into the studio this morning, knowing who our guest was about to be, I think you expected the worst podcast, one of your nightmares.
Well, I just knew that you might tease us a lot. So thank you for that, Paul. You did very well.
Well, I've looked it up, and just for future reference, there is a Take Your Child to Work Day, which in America is April the 23rd. As far as I'm able to tell, there is no Take Your Significant Other to Work Day.
Okay.
So for future, please don't.
We could find a day and we could all do it, because our significant others often have interests aligned but not exactly the same as our own, and it's always great learning from each other.
Yes, I talk far more about Lancashire police and things such as this with my significant other than I would do otherwise,
Yes,
talking about the police around here, yes.
But here's the thing. Did you spot it? It's all about the accounting. So
No, for you... I want to stop you there. For you, it was all about the accounting. I noticed that Jason couldn't wait to move on very quickly from the discussion of accounting. It was yes, Jan, you just go in that room, do your accounting. I'll do the real work out here.
Yeah, but I think that's probably fair enough. But what's quite interesting, and this has been shown time and time again in the accounting history literature, which appreciate that some of our listeners might be accountants and might look at accounting historians. People can deny things happen. They can say, no, this never happened. Those people weren't ever there. But the accounting records, particularly in this older period where accounting records were much more foundational and people kept and then preserved these records of, for example, parts of the army being in a particular place and the amount of bullets that were used, for example, exist. So if you say, oh, no, there was no massacre here, then it's actually, you can put those two things together and go, oh, hang about. So this is quite interesting in that we wouldn't have known about those eagle deaths unless there was a bounty system, an accounting system, etc. So those historical accounting records sometimes give us a glimpse back into ecological and social conditions of the past. And I find that, quite exciting.
And there's so much to learn there about what happened to the golden eagle population, when it dipped, why it dipped, how people were being rewarded for the fact that it was dipping, and then how it slowly recovered and compared to how it is now to then. And it tells a story not just about golden eagles, but about other species as well, because golden eagles are going to be far from unique when it comes to being persecuted and hunted to that local level of extinction.
It's the same as a canary in the coal mine, is that actually some of these apex predators tell you about the underlying health of what's going on in the landscape as well. So that's great. So, but what are we going to talk about next?
I'm going to talk about your husband's creation of the word fighty, which I found to be particularly brilliant. I'm going to use that now. I'm not going to say aggressive or anything like that. I'm going to say fighty.
I wonder if it's a Scotticism.
I don't know. Maybe it is. I shall ask when I get home. Yes, I do have a Scot at home, a resident Scot who can tell me, who uses sometimes words which I've never heard before. And which,
I think fighty is a good example.
Yeah. But having discussed that, next time we're going to be joined by someone from here at Lancaster University talking to us all about big projects and their relations to net zero, how you manage projects, and a particular project that's going on here at Lancaster University, which is changing the way we have energy here at the university. That's going to be Anna Cockman, and she's going to be joining us next week.
Brilliant. I look forward to it.
So do I. Until then, thank you very much for listening. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bevington.